Yes.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm going to ask everybody to mute their microphone unless you're one of the speakers, please. And Steve, why don't you start and we'll jump in.
Sure, love the informality here. So good afternoon to all the DEC members. Welcome to today's virtual seminar. I'm Steve Gregorian, President and CEO of the Detroit Economic Club. Great to see you all today. A couple of super quick announcements before we get started. I just want to take a brief second to thank the 120 terrific DEC sponsors for their continued support of our mission. And I want to make sure you're aware of our next two upcoming events. November 23rd, we'll be joined by Mike Wells, CEO of Prudential, and December 7th, really excited because I got an advanced copy of his book. Chris Whipple is the author of a new book called The Spy Masters: How the CIA Directors Shape History and the Future. So that's on December 7th. As Lynn mentioned, we do want your video on today. So if you got the Tuesday grumpies, get over it, put on your pretend happy face, and we want to see you. So let's get started. The Institute for Civility in Government recently defined civility as the hard work of staying present and respectful of those with which we have deep disagreements. Without civility, we do not have a democracy. We have a shouting match. Last Saturday, I played a chilly round of golf with a couple of buddies that I picked up, and they're clearly on opposite ends of the political spectrum from me. And on the ride, we got into it pretty good on the topic of the election. We did, happy to report, stay present and respectful. So we were not swinging golf clubs at each other's heads on the first tee. And today, DEC members are taking part in the Civility Project. The goal of the project is to build healthy disagreement and constructive dialogue. We'll be joined by two familiar faces who you've already seen, Nolan, Finley, and Stephen Henderson. Nolan's the editorial page editor of the Detroit News, and Stephen is the host of Detroit Today on WDET Radio. They both also co-host One Detroit on DPTV. Facilitating our session today is Lynn Golodner. Lynn is the Chief Creative Officer for Your People, LLC, which is a storytelling and strategy agency. So hello, good afternoon, Nolan, Stephen, and Lynn. Looking forward to today's session. And Lynn, I invite you to take the reins.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks to the DEC. We will get started in a minute. I'd like to first start with a video from our sponsor, Delta Dental, who very generously makes the Civility Project possible to all of you and all of us for free because they underwrite what we do. So let's hear from them briefly.
Politics is polarizing. Racism is rampant. The pandemic is frightening, and families are divided. Tough times require more dialogue and more understanding. But navigating our differences constructively is hard work. Delta Dental believes that healthy, smart, vibrant communities are also civil and harmonious. They are places where disagreement does not have to be toxic or destructive. Civility starts with listening. Welcome to the Civility Project.
So we're really grateful to Delta Dental for making this possible, and we're grateful to all of you for being here today. I just want to let you know that as we get started, please make use of the chat. Any questions you have as we go through the conversation, we will address them as they come in. And the way the format is going to go today, we're together for 90 minutes. Stephen and Nolan will start. We'll have a little bit of a conversation, and then we're going to jump into two breakout sessions where we're going to have smaller conversations. We'll give you some questions to start with, and you can explore that in a group of 4 to 5 people. We'll come back together, deconstruct it, discuss it, and go back in, and then we'll finish up on live Q&A. So I would like to begin by asking Stephen and Nolan to introduce how the Civility Project came to be and what we are talking about when we talk about civility.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Steve. And it is good to be back with our old friends at the Detroit Economic Club. It feels like a long time. Good to see your faces, and I'm glad everybody has their cameras on. Again, also thanks to Delta Dental Plans, our sponsor of the Civility project. I mean, a lot of you know us and know our history, so we don't maybe perhaps we don't need to get too deep into all that, but this civility project sort of grew out of our personal interactions professionally and personally. I mean, when Steve first came to the editorial page job at the Free Press, I was already here. People like to put us together in hopes that we'd give them an entertaining fight. And, we tried to do just that. But in the process of doing so, we started to learn a lot about each other and what what formed the basis of who we are, and we moved past the assumptions people normally form about folks on based on their political views or other characteristics, and we started to try to get to know the why of each other in terms of our decision making and our political beliefs. And in the process of doing that, we found out that we could have some pretty vigorous conversations. The conversation you described amongst your golf pals, Steve. We found that we could do that and still maintain a friendship, and we can increasingly do it in a more civil and productive manner than just sort of the shouting matches you're so familiar seeing on television. And we still get into a little of that, but we found out we could be more productive, on a professional level, but also enjoy a deeper personal relationship without giving an inch on where we stand politically. I mean, I will let Steve then talk about the StoryCorps project that really gave this civility project its shape.
Yeah, as Nolan said, over the last 12 years, really, we have come to be good working colleagues, sort of opposite sides of the political fence, and people sort of inviting us to come and argue in front of audiences. But we also really have developed a genuine respect for each other's work and respect for each other personally, and we've become good friends. And really about 4 or 5 years ago, I would say, I think both of us started to notice a change in the way that people from different sides of political or cultural divides were relating to each other. I mean, it's not like there was never a time when everybody just got along, but things got decidedly worse. In the run up to the 2016 election, the later years of the Obama presidency, I think both of us in our roles at the newspapers at that time really gave us front row seats to some of the incredible incivility that people started to indulge, not just sometimes and not just over the most controversial issues, but just as a matter of course. I mean, people really just dropped all of the sort of dressings of the idea of reasonable discourse and exchange and just started getting after each other. And it was about around that time that the NPR project called StoryCorps came to Detroit. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, StoryCorps is an effort to capture narrative stories about people's relationships. People take their spouses, people take their children, people take their parents or close friends down, and they talk for an hour about that relationship and how it came about, how it maintains itself, and why it's valuable to them. So instead of taking a spouse or a relative, I took Nolan with me down to StoryCorps. And I told him that we were going so that we could talk not about the things that we always talk about on TV or radio and arguing about politics, but I wanted us to talk about ourselves. I wanted us to talk about where these points of view that we hold come from. Why does he consider himself a conservative? What was it in his life and his background, his experiences that led him to believe the things that he believes, and that I would do the same thing, and that we would talk about those two things. And we sat in this little trailer on the lawn of the Detroit Institute of Arts for an hour in front of microphones and recorded that. And both of us, I think, learned things we didn't know about the other. And both of us also, I think, came to understand a lot more about the other person, and not just what they think, but why they think it. And I think that was a real turning point in the run up to the idea of the Civility Project.
Mhm.
Our ability to do that was important, to be able to have that conversation. But also the idea that if other people could have that same conversation, if other people could take time away from fighting and arguing and really sit down and talk to somebody about where their views come from, why do they think the things that they do, I think it makes it a lot easier to talk about civil discourse and exchange. It makes it a lot harder to disrespect somebody and their point of view when you really know what motivates them and where they're coming from. And so, the last couple of years, of course, we've seen discourse get even worse, if that was possible, than it was 4 or 5 years ago, to the point where people just don't bother anymore.
Yeah.
People who disagree do not interact with one another. And so we launched this project about 1.5 years ago as a way of reversing that, of encouraging people not to step away, not to say that they won't interact with people they don't agree with, but to give them tools and a path to being able to do it in a way that doesn't feel so bad, that doesn't discourage the idea of that exchange, and brings you real value out of discussions and debates with people you don't agree with.
And so, we got to thinking about this, and it occurred to us, this is a process that should start at the beginning of a relationship, rather than well into it, when perhaps assumptions have already been formed and hard feelings may have already developed. And so we tested this out during the Mackinac Policy Conference a couple of 3 years ago, and a little exercise in which we took groups of people, individuals, who didn't who shared very little in common, they thought, but who certainly were from different political perspectives. And we put these individuals together. There were about 40 pairs, I think, and asked them to go through this process. Don't talk politics, talk about each other. Ask questions, find out where the person opposite of you is coming from and how they came to their political views. Do that first, so that you have so that you're less likely to assign negative characteristics to that person based on how they believe. And we had 2 ladies who had their neighbors, and they had walked together every morning for years, and they knew that they were on different political sides, that they voted differently, but they took the time during this session to ask why, and the reasons they voted the way they did were a complete shock to each other. They had made assumptions about why their friend was politically the way they were, but they'd never bothered to find out. And it was eye-opening for them, and it produced an easier relationship. They didn't have to walk on eggshells and avoid political discussions. And that's, that's sort of what we're after here, to get people to stop avoiding political discussions. Half the people in America don't know anyone, don't have a friend who thinks differently than they do on politics. That's not a good place. We got 2/3 of Americans say they're afraid to talk about their political views. They're afraid of the consequences. We're never going to get a place where we can solve problems together if we're not willing to talk, and if we don't understand other people. There's a tendency to assign very negative qualities to people who disagree with you politically. You only have to turn on the cable TV shows to see that. We have a tendency to think, gosh, you don't think like me, you're on the other side, you're evil, you're ignorant, you want to destroy the country, you have some bad ulterior motives at work here. And what we've found and what we believe is that most people on most issues come to their positions the same way. They take the facts, they take the information, the data, they apply their own personal values and experiences to it, and they come up to a decision. If that position is different than yours, it doesn't make them evil and it doesn't make them stupid. And we need to move past that point to build that respect for each other so we can have productive conversations.
So it's interesting because Diane put in the chat, she totally agrees, which is why we avoid the confrontation. Mm-hmm. And Diane, you bring up a really good point, because I think a lot of people assume if they enter into a conversation with someone on another side from them, it will be a confrontation. And I think that provides a great segue into the next question, which I want to pose to Nolan and Stephen, to lead up to our breakout sessions, which are going to happen in about 5 or 6 minutes. But maybe you can talk about how, practically speaking, especially as we come out of this election, head into the holiday season, still deep in a pandemic, how do we go about starting to have these conversations and not make them confrontational or uncomfortable, but really productive? So what are some tips that people can put into action?
So, I mean, when we talk about civility, I think we start with a couple of pretty basic foundational principles that kind of form civil relationships and civil conversations. And the first one, and probably the most important, is the concept of listening. We talk a lot about listening to the person that you're talking to. And when we say that word, I often say, I think we mean something really different than what most of us commonly think of when we think about listening. I think for a lot of us, listening just means not talking, right? If I'm in a conversation and I'm not saying something, then that means I'm listening to the person who's talking. And I think for us, it actually means something a little more complex than that. A lot of times when we're in a conversation and not talking, we're still in our own heads about what we just said or about what we might say next when this other person stops talking. Maybe we're judging the person who's talking, judging what they're saying as they're saying it. We're not really listening from the standpoint of trying to understand where that person is coming from. What is this person really trying to say? What is the sort of basis for where this person is coming from? I mean, it's a more active activity than I think we commonly think of when we use the word listening. It's sort of an active listening, and it's a respectful exercise. It's taking yourself out of the equation in many ways. And putting the focus on the person who's talking and what they're saying. And that's really hard to do. It's my job to do that. It's my job to be able to listen in that way. And there are times when I find myself thinking about, well, what am I going to say when this person stops talking? Or I find myself judging the person who's talking instead of listening. I think you have to sort of put yourself in the mindset that, look, I really am trying to understand this person who's talking and understand what they're saying, as opposed to chomping at the bit for the time when I get to jump back at what they're talking about. Another kind of key principle we talk about is the idea of staying, the idea of committing to the conversation and the committing to the relationship. Nolan and I have been sort of arguing and debating about things in this community for 12 years, maybe 13 years now. And we get into it. I mean, when we say civility, we don't mean nice. We don't mean polite all the time. There are times when we really bitterly disagree about stuff, and when there's a lot of emotional charge to the subjects that we're talking about, or our individual investment in the side that we're on. But when we're finished, we always get up from the table and say, well, I'll see you next time. I'll be back. I'm not leaving for good. I'm not walking away and saying, I can't stand this guy. I don't understand where he's coming from. I'm not talking to him anymore. We never say that it's the end. It is a rolling conversation. It is a rolling debate. And the idea on both sides is that even though neither of us has much hope of changing the other's mind or any expectation of that there's value that each of us draws from the exchange itself. It matters to me to know what Nolan thinks and how he comes to that opinion, and that's why we continue to have the conversation. That's also not easy. There are lots of times, especially right now, when I think we feel so strongly about things, and the world seems so charged with emotion about these issues, that it's easier just to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to have a conversation with this person that saying things that really work me up and really draw the worst of emotions right to the surface. You have to sort of actively say, I'm going to do this because I draw some value out of it. The things in our culture right now that define these spaces of disagreement also make it easier to walk away than to stay. Think about social media and think about things like Twitter and Facebook and the power to lock people out of your life on those platforms. The block button on Twitter or on Facebook, which is this, weaponizes the idea of disagreement. And then, of course, it's not enough to block somebody. You always then go and tell everybody else, I blocked this person, right? I'm done with this person. I'm not going to talk with them anymore. There's almost a rewarding kind of culture that's grown up around that on social media that discourages the idea of staying in a conversation. The 24-hour cable news cycle also, I think, is a real culprit here. This idea of starkly drawn sides forced together into small spaces so they can essentially fight to the death, vanquish the other side and leave no ambiguity about who's right or who's wrong, or whether there's merit in things that both people say. I mean, there is this battle culture that they have set up that I think, again, discourages the sort of long-term and consistent engagement across political lines. And so those two things, I think, the listening and the commitment to the engagement are the kind of hallmark posts of civil relationships and conversations.
And Lynn, I know
Steve,
we'll,
yeah.
I know
go
we'll
ahead.
get into more tips after the breakout. I just want to build on one thing Steve said, and the question, the person who asked the question. It's okay to feel uncomfortable. I mean, the goal perhaps is not always to have a conversation that in which everybody is particularly comfortable and all of your real feelings are held inside because you're afraid to express them because, oh, that person might be uncomfortable. And again, you get to that point by building trust first, by understanding the things Steve said, that it's going to be okay no matter what we talk about. It's going to be okay no matter how angry we get. It's going to be all right because I understand this person and I know this is a good person. I respect them. And on your golf outing the other day, Steve, you mentioned you started to feel uncomfortable, but hopefully you also learned something about the other person or from the other person in the process. Not that you changed any views, but hopefully you came to some better understanding of how they think and how they feel, and developed also a little more trust so that you could do this again. Hey, we were able to have this conversation and we didn't kill each other, so maybe we'll try it again. Steve and I were together the other night talking about who knows, any number of things, but we also touched on for a bit on family histories, and that led to conversation about race, and we had sort of a very easy conversation about these very, very difficult issues, and I'm not sure would have been possible 6, 7, 8 years ago.
So I know Chris offered a really great question, but I'd like to get to that after we get into our breakout groups. And so we're going to go into breakout groups in a moment. I'm going to put you guys into random groups and I will broadcast the question. But what we want to know is what motivates your political position? Like what is important to you and how do you arrive at your politics? And so we're not arguing who to vote for or anything, but just everybody has a political leaning, and think about what motivates yours. And we're just going to talk about that for about 6 or 7 minutes. And you guys will get a sort of 1-minute warning when it's about to end, and you'll come back to the main room and we will all talk about it, and then we'll jump into a second one. So I'm going to arrange these now and get you guys into groups, and let's go. So. Well, welcome back, everybody. I'll wait for everyone to be here.
That was
So
good
is every-
timing. I think the timing on it was really good, Len. You know,
Oh, I'm so glad.
wasn't too short. I think everyone got a good objective in, and then we were called out. So it was good. Thank you.
Awesome. You're welcome. You'll have another few minutes to chat in a little bit. But now that everybody's back, I'd love to invite anyone who'd like to share any realizations, anything that happened in your group. Was there an experience that you haven't had before? We'd like to hear from you about how that went.
I'll go.
Okay.
Jonathan Satterfield here, Driven Business Solutions. I'm a CPA, run a small public practice, and I actually had another financial professional in my group. And financial professionals, along with business school graduates and attorneys, historically become extremely, extremely conservative post-graduation. It's how the system is built. And he was like, I always identified, with the economy and economic conservatism, which and political conservatism, at least how we define it now, are pretty closely linked. But he was like, I found as I got older and you see the effects of the system that I've actually become more liberal and less conservative because, and it seemed like there was an implied statement. So I'll add that this is my implied, because the system doesn't actually play out the way they teach you it's going to in these places. And sometimes you don't see those outcomes for a long time. And so that last part wasn't implied, but as a young financial professional who aligns, pretty politically and socially liberal, but still an economic conservatism because we have to pay for it somehow, it's really, it's heartening to hear that, because that's some of that structural change that at least I personally feel would be beneficial to the economy at large, without regard to race, creed, culture, political affiliation, current economic standpoint. Like, everyone would win at the end of the day with just some of this common ground. Let's get back to center and away from the polls.
Awesome. So did you feel that it was a really comfortable experience, that it was like a safe space to talk about it, even if you guys had different views in the group?
I have always actually, and I'll give this to Steve Gregorian, I've always actually found the DEC a particularly safe space to have really difficult conversations, period. And so hats off to Steve and the DEC for providing that space, because there's people from every walk of life on this meeting right now, from the most successful to just getting started, probably every race, creed, culture, and religion. And it's like they said, it's listening and being respectful. You don't have to agree. You can agree to disagree, but can we at least say, like, have a great day, I'll see you next time at the end of it?
Perfect. You're like a poster child for civility. I love it, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else want to share what happened in their group or any experiences they had with this conversation?
Here?
Yes.
Unfortunately, both of us were the same political persuasion. So, but I think both of us talked about how we got there. And that was the interesting part. And we also agreed that part of this civility and part of this discourse is the importance of trying to talk to people that don't necessarily agree with us. And we've got to pick those points. And I think Nolan mentioned this earlier. Pick these points that we can agree on, and then we can move on from there. But it's
good. Awesome. Thank you so much. Anybody else want to jump in and offer something from their group?
Armin, you had your hand raised the last time. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you. So I was just going to say I sort of got cut off because we ran out of time. So I wanted to finish my thought process. And the thought process was along the lines of, why are we here? And I think that one of the main reasons why we're here is to help other people. And I think that is sort of formulated a lot of my thinking and developing how I think politically, is to think about how we're helping other people of other races or nationalities or immigrants or underserved communities or whatever it might be. How are we helping, and what are we going to say at the end of our lives that, you know, we achieved more financial success, or did we achieve, you know, making the world a better place? And so that's really what's formulated my thinking. And I didn't always have that thinking. That thinking has sort of evolved over time. And it's gone sort of, I was raised by a more liberal father, and I became more conservative after going through business school, and now I've become a little bit more liberal. So it's sort of a evolving process based on, you know, all the different inputs that we get throughout our lives. But I think that really what it comes down to it is, how are we helping other people?
Lynn, can I jump in there? I think that's an important
Please.
point, Armin, because
Yes.
whether I talk to conservatives or liberals, that's a common theme. How do we make a world a better place? And Steve and I talk about this a lot of times in our own personal views. We want the same things. We want the world to be a better place. We want our communities to be a better place. You know, we want better lives and opportunities for our families. It's the getting there. How do we get there is the difference. So, but once you realize you want to get to this same place, you know, that makes the discussion over your differences on of strategies to get there much more productive.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think you raised some really good points, Armin, that are going to help us with our next breakout session, which I'll introduce in a minute. I just want to have one last call if anybody else wants to jump in and share what happened in their group. All right. So when we go back into these groups, the thing we'd like to focus on is what, from your background, experiences, values, upbringing, any of those details lead you to your position. And so it's getting to know one another on that human level. So let's jump in. We'll have about 7 minutes to do that, and then we will come back together for some Q&A. Welcome back, everybody.
Thank you. I'm a little jealous that elderly couple that said, "Oh, we just got out of the pool." Well, that
So,
sounds actually kind of nice right now.
right? So now that we're back, how did that change the conversation, getting to know people on a more personal level? So tell me a little bit or share a little bit about what happened in your group before we open it up to our Q&A.
Well, Lynn, I can certainly go ahead. We got cut off, but hearing the background for me was very impactful in driving perception and being able to see. And even in our limited time, my mind was opened on a couple of different things, and I really appreciated that. So being able to have the good conversation to really understand and build that trust that I think we're starting to talk about, I thought that was beneficial for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. Who else had an experience in the group that they'd like to talk about?
Ours was a continuation. We naturally flowed. Maybe we just all clicked. It was a continuation from the earlier part. Understanding, frankly, that, you know, we are all some of our experiences, the value that brings. We also recognize that as things are closer to us and impact us directly, we may have, frankly, visions and differences about things that are a little bit more tangential in a way. And yeah, I'm not just saying it because it sounds good. We had a very collaborative process. If anything, 85% of the things we agree on, and the 15% is the spice that makes it taste good, right? Where you can make a choice.
I love it. That's great. I love that your group clicked like that. That's wonderful. Anybody else?
I think, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Katrina, go ahead.
Go ahead, Katrina.
I was going to say our group was also a continuation of what we spoke about before. I think we actually did get personal already in the first session, but the one thing that stuck out to me is Hank was talking about, we were talking about our journeys, because some of us had, you know, switched sides, so to speak. You know, he made the observation that many people live in a bubble, and that unless you go out and, you know, you have new experiences, you move to new places, you meet new people that are from different backgrounds from you, that people that may do that might, you know, switch their minds or pivot a little bit more, and people that, you know, maybe grow up in the same area and don't move, and then, you know, remain in that same area may not change. And I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Diane, did you want to say something too?
Yeah, I guess I was just going to add that I think with several of the participants in our group, there was a common theme of a change of positioning, I think, as they went through their adult lives and careers or professions or what have you. I think, and I can't say this for sure, depending upon which generation I'm talking to, but it seems like there is much more acceptance of questioning positioning than maybe there was 30, 40 years ago, what have you. We got to talking a little bit about religion and faith and some of the abuse that's come out. And I think years back, things weren't questioned, you know, and they were tolerated. Not to say we're not tolerating today, but I do think we're moving in this direction where we're not willing to accept things just because we're part of a certain group or what have you. And that's a good thing in the long run.
Hey, Lynn, can I jump in on
Yeah,
that? Because Diane said something that just triggers something in my head.
Yeah.
We all feel like we evolve over time, right? I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago when I started in this job, and my beliefs change, my opinions change. We're different people than we were when we were younger, perhaps, and we'll be different people when we're older. And yet, time and time again, we're seeing people in the public square be brutalized, canceled, punished for something they believed or said 20, 25 years ago. We wouldn't apply that same standard to ourselves. I wouldn't. And yet some, increasingly now, because everything's available at a finger stroke, a finger click, we pull out something from somebody's past and say, look what they said in 1980. Look what they wrote in 1988. It's very destructive. And anyway, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. I'd love to jump into some questions, and I know that we haven't even touched on a lot of the topics we normally do. So please feel free to throw your questions and comments in the chat so we can address them. But Stephen and Nolan, I'd like to put before you Chris's question. Thank you, Chris, for being so patient to wait for the answer. And he said before the breakout groups, do you think it is unreasonable to ask the other person in the conversation to come to the table with an open mind, including the potential to be influenced by a compelling argument supported by data? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course it's reasonable to ask the person, but you don't want to invite anybody to the table with this sense of smugness, this sense of self-righteousness. You want to invite somebody to the table and expect an open mind. You have to have one yourself. And you have to recognize that, all of this stuff, you've gathered together doesn't necessarily make you right in the other person's mind. They have different experiences, and particularly when you're talking about opinions. I think Steve mentioned it earlier. Keep an open mind on both sides of the table. Drop the smugness, drop the self-righteousness, and understand that a conversation is not a competition. This goes back to what Steve was talking about earlier. Listen, you're not trying to convert. He noted we haven't converted each other in all these years, and it wouldn't be nearly as much fun if we did. I don't know what we'd do if suddenly one of us woke up and said, oh, I'm a liberal now, I'm a conservative. I'm not sure we'd have any use at all for each other. So, it's not a competition, and you're not out to convert, you're out to learn. If you come to that table with all your information and your data and your stats, that's fine. But also come with this idea that maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I could learn something from this person rather than me trying to convert or convince or win this argument.
Well, and Chris also mentioned something in his question that I think is really important. And maybe Stephen, you want to talk about this, but he talked about a compelling argument supported by data. And so now we have the open, Pandora's box of whose data and what news to rely on and what sources, and how does this online 24/7 culture, cable news, social media impact this whole issue of building civility?
Yeah, I would be remiss as a journalist if I didn't sit here and say that we have a serious, serious problem in our culture right now with the very idea of truth, with the acceptance of fact as fact and not something that we debate. That has made some of the policy problems we have to sort through a lot tougher to deal with. There are interests who I think actively try to undermine the idea of truth and fact, and try to say that these are not truths or facts, and it's interesting to see how far they want to go with it. The pandemic, I think, has invited a new level of bizarre attacks on fact and especially on science. But I think you can accept that and set aside the dismissal of, or the over-reliance on those things in interpersonal exchanges about things. And I think that's one of the things that we're emphasizing here is, big time policy debates, decision-making, those kind of things are different than the way that we interact with the people in our own spaces. When we talk about civility, we are really talking about the people that the people that you deal with at work or at school or in your neighborhood or your community. And the idea of valuing interchange and interaction with those people. That doesn't mean that fact doesn't matter in those discussions. And I think, you know, the more you can move a discussion toward that, I think the better it is, the better it is for everybody. I mean, we do need to be able to agree on some pretty basic facts about things just to have discussion. But I also think Nolan's right that that too often what we end up doing is trying to use fact or data to win an argument or discredit somebody else. And that's not useful in the space that we're talking about. It's super important at the policy level. It's super important at the decision-making level. And we've lost the ability to do that consistently. And that's why we have some of the problems that we have right now. But that's it's a different sphere than what we're talking about with interpersonal debate and discussion.
So Jonathan asked an important question. He said, do you think we need to expand from left and right, conservative and liberal?
You know, that's a good question. I think most of the country does live somewhere in between those two. And the problem with defining ourselves and our politics today, you look at these two parties and both of them seem to be controlled more and more by their extremes, by the loudest voices, by the people who are demanding the most. And those folks who sort of go back and forth across that middle line don't get a whole lot of representation or a whole lot of voice and attention, even though they're a big number. I don't know what it's going to take, if it's going to take a third party or something else. But you see in both of these parties today something interesting happening, a struggle between the extremes and the moderates. You've got a lot of anti-Trump Republicans now finding a voice and saying, let's get this party back focused on its, what it wants. And you have a very public conflict going on amongst Democrats between their moderates and their more far left members. And it's good we have two parties. You don't want both parties to come to the same place. I mean, this system was based on having productive dissent, but I think we need to be close. Center left and center right is a far more productive place for these parties to be than far left and far right.
Stephen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, and to be honest, I mean, there are some dynamics built into the system that reward that kind of extremism. I mean, I am somebody who talks a lot about the rule making and process making versus the results in political context, in government context, and the way we allow rules and standards to be drawn in government right now really does reward extremism. If you think about the way that most states, for instance, allow political lines to be drawn. What congressional district do you live in? What state house or state senate district do you live in? That's an entirely political process in most states, and it's based on whoever happens to have the most control in the decennial year, which is a completely random way to decide that. And what that does is it allows one party to draw the map in a way that favors its dominance, its political dominance. And what we've seen in a state like Michigan is that you end up with districts where there is no competition across party lines. You have most districts drawn in a way so that the competition is inside of a party. And when that's true, the extremes have a lot better chance of winning out. And of course, now we're going to do it differently in Michigan. And we're going to say that politics is not at the center of that endeavor. And hopefully what we come up with is a map that encourages more people who can represent both sides, people who can see merits in one party and see merits in another, even though they might belong to a party, be able to say, well, this party has this thing right, and I don't think that's a bad thing. In fact, that's a good thing, and not fear that doing that results in a primary challenge that probably unseats you. That's one of the things I think that'll help, I think, move beyond this really, really entrenched, bitter, extreme partisanship.
And there was a time not long ago when each party had conservatives, liberals, and moderates. You didn't necessarily gravitate to a political party based on, well, I'm conservative, I'm going to join Republicans. I'm a liberal, I'm going to join Democrats. There were places within the party for a diversity of views, and we've lost that. And I think that has also hurt this ability to work across party lines and build coalitions.
So in our remaining minutes together, I wonder if you guys can provide a quick little sort of recap of, we're post-election, we're still a little bit in limbo in some regards. Can you give us some words of wisdom to take us forward? Everybody here obviously has a desire to build civility and understand how to do that. So what can we do to sort of, have a new tomorrow and a better back and forth? Any thoughts as we head into this transition of power at some point?
Well, Steve's far more elegant on this than I am, but I would just say, remind everybody that the system worked. We had an election. Nobody was cheated, despite, all of the uproar. And we are gradually coming, I think, the broad base of America is coming to this realization. Nobody was cheated. We had an election, the people spoke. The person this time who won the popular vote also won the electoral vote. So the will of the people was expressed. We'll go into January 20th, I think, with once again, a peaceful transfer of power. There'll be some squawking and some kicking and screaming, but I do believe that we will have an orderly transition, and we're building toward that because the pressure is building among the people who value the institutions and the country more than they value the party, are starting to exert their influence. And so the system worked once again, more messy perhaps this time than in the past. But just as in 2000, we managed to get through a situation in an environment that might have torn other countries completely apart or destroyed them altogether. And it won't do it this time to us, and hopefully it never will.
Yeah, I mean, I have been counseling a lot right now, the idea of patience and calm. Cable news loves to indulge the idea of overreaction. The headlines scream all day breaking news. I mean, there's never a time on CNN that they don't have that breaking news banner up. And most of the time they are not talking about anything that is urgent. Each little quarter turn of the screw in this story about what happens post-election is announced as though it's the end of creation. That's just not true. That there are things that are happening that are unusual. There are some things that are happening that are unprecedented. But I keep saying, every day there's a list of things that are supposed to be happening, and most of the days, those things are happening. There's one thing really right now that's not happening, and that's that the current occupant of the White House is not participating in the transition process, which could mean something quite significant if that's still true in a month. If he doesn't begin to open up, the process of government to the new administration. That's going to cause us some problems. But if you think back to 2000, that same thing happened because it wasn't decided until December 12th. And so you had this very abbreviated transition. Now, a lot of people believe that that was invitation for some of the mischief that went on, and that it made the country susceptible to things like the 9/11 terrorist attacks that made us less prepared to be able to do those things. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But overreacting to every day this alarmist kind of reporting. I have a conversation with my mom, it seems like every week now, where I've got to tell her, no, that's not true. Yeah, this is happening, but it doesn't mean these things. They've been really good on television about saying not only what's happening, but it means that this will happen next, or that this won't happen next. And I got to walk my mom off the ledge every 6 days or so because of it. I think resisting that and trying to look at it from a standpoint of what's supposed to be happening right now, and let's worry about that and get through it. Get to the next thing is one of the ways to avoid some of the really overheated and angry confrontation that we see so much of.
So aside from adopting a meditation or deep breathing practice, what can the rest of us do, practically speaking? Because yes, that's at the top level, the leadership level, but we have a deeply divided country of people. And so what can the rest of us who are on this call today and in our communities do to start repairing that, so that we don't have such deeply disconnected sides? Any thoughts?
I guess, understand that, you may feel extraordinarily positive about what happened. Somebody else might feel extraordinarily negative. Don't assume, your feelings are universal. Understand that other people react and feel differently. And it's, show some empathy, show some understanding. Things are going to go the other way eventually. It's a pendulum in this country. You lose one time, you win the next. And yet, for the most part, we progress, and we're at a critical time on a number of issues in our country now that sort of got set aside the last couple of months because of the election, rather than sort of being integral to the campaign discussions. A lot of very, very important issues that we were wrestling with early in the year sort of became muted during the election. We're going to have to come back at those in January. We're going to have to come back at those with an ability to speak to each other, an ability to understand each other, and to converse with that goal of understanding. It's going to be critical in the months ahead. These issues didn't go away because we changed presidents.
I also think the holidays, and they'll be different this year because we can't all be together the way that we normally can. But I think they're an opportunity to work on this kind of thing. And what I mean by that is, your family is the closest you have in terms of interpersonal relationships. And I'm somebody who is from a very progressive family with a rich history of progressive activism and things like that. But I've got this one uncle and aunt who are the most conservative people you will ever meet in your life. They are 24-hour a day, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, watching. Yeah, I mean, these are hardcore conservatives. And they've been that way my entire life. And being able to talk with them about this stuff, that's always where I start, right? This is my family. These are blood relatives who just see the world really differently than I do, and then the rest of the family does. And so when you're together over the holidays, it's really an opportunity to see, okay, well, how do I do this? How do I negotiate this in a way that doesn't leave everybody feeling really bad about themselves or angry at each other? How do we come to an agreement about the way to talk about these things, even if we can't come to an agreement about these things themselves? And I have come over the years to really value that opportunity, because there's less risk, frankly, in that relationship than there is in other places. They're always going to be my family. You can't get rid of them. You know, to be able to do that in that kind of environment, you know, it is stressful sometimes, and it does sometimes lead to hurt feelings. But again, that idea that you don't walk away in that case because you can't really, but that you keep coming back, it's a good time to try that out. Now, again, this year is a little different, and I don't know what Thanksgiving will look like for anybody by the time we get there next week. But I think, again, starting in the places that you can do this with the least amount of risk, and the places where you have some control over you know, over the relationship, makes sense. And then you sort of broaden it out to other places where maybe there's a little more risk.
Yeah, remember, it's not all about politics. It feels so now, perhaps, but it's not all about politics. I had a cousin who dropped everybody in the family off Facebook after the 2016 election. She didn't want anything to do with any of us. And, you know, then her dad got sick, you know, and she needed family. And, you know, you need these people. And, you know, she came to realize they're a family. They're more than just their politics. And we're all more than just our politics. You know, find those things where you do connect and where you do mean a lot to each other, and be tolerant. I remember that first Thanksgiving after the 2016 election, we just sat down for Thanksgiving dinner, and my brother-in-law burst through the door all flustered. He said, "Please don't nobody talk to me about Donald Trump. This is my third try at a Thanksgiving dinner today, and I got no place else to go." So, you know, just be tolerant.
So we have one final question before I'll hand it back to Steve Gregorian. And the question is, so the person says that in their opinion, the current president empowers overt, rude treatment by people heated by current political events. So the question is, does a new administration lower that temperature? Thoughts about that?
I think there's no question the new administration will be very different. You almost had no chance of electing another person who'd lean into incivility quite as much as this president did. And that's, you know, I mean, that's who he is. That's who he's been. I don't know that anyone should have been surprised by the last 4 years. I do think that, you know, the one of the really unfortunate things is that Trump's incivility has given green light, I feel like, to incivility in other places. It's made people who want to do that kind of thing, whether they're on the left or the right, frankly, it's given them cover and said it's okay to behave that way. And that's the danger as we go forward. He's going to leave, right? He's going to go and do whatever it is he's going to do after being president. But the rest of us still got to figure out how to govern and live together. And I expect that Joe Biden, who, you know, has been in public service for, you know, most of my lifetime, and has always been somebody who respected not only the process but his opponents. I expect that he will do some really overt things early on to try to signal that he's headed in a different direction. That doesn't mean he won't be partisan. He will. He should be. But the incivility and the disrespect, I think, will go away in this next administration in a demonstrable way. I think they will do some things to say really strongly, this is not who we are or who we should be.
I hope you're right. I hope they resist this instinct to settle scores, to get even. One of the big disappointments is, I'll echo Steve, of what happened over these past 4 years is this idea that we use the president's behavior as an excuse to justify our own bad behavior. You don't have to mimic what you see, and you don't have to lower your own standards. And I think there's been across the board a lot of lowering of standards. I don't have as much faith that Joe Biden's the great healer. I think he's got some of his own issues and wanting to be a tough guy and what have you. But but it might have been a good time for a woman president.
Well, I like that idea. But on that note,
Who knows?
I
They
just
have one soon.
We may have one
Right.
sooner than you think. That's okay.
So before we hand things over to Steve Gregorian, I just want to mention 2 things to everybody. And thank you again for being here today. First of all, we do send out a monthly newsletter with resources about civility building, tips to continue doing it. So if you'd like to be on our list, please put your email in the chat and I will add you. And then there's no selling, it's just information and resources. But with that in mind, because we do these sessions free to people who host them and people who attend, we want to welcome you to think about bringing the Civility Project to your workplace, to your community. We've done programs this year, an incredible number of programs actually during the pandemic, because we have the flexibility of Zoom. We've been from coast to coast, actually, from Washington State to Maryland and everywhere in between. And we've spoken to church groups and to associations and to communities and workplaces and just a lot of different types of groups. And so if this speaks to you and you think it would be helpful in your community, let me know. I think January is full and February is getting there. So speak up now, because we want to book you in and we would love to work with you on that. So,
And we've done it all, Lynn, without wearing pants.
I know, right? Isn't that great? So, and on that note, I'd like to hand it back over to Steve Gregorian to close us out and to thank everybody again for being here.
Did you have to leave me, Nolan, with that visual, please? My goodness. In all sincerity, my phone's been blowing up with texts of people that have been on this, and they've said unanimously what a fabulous program. So there was never a better time to do this than now. Thank you to Stephen, Nolan, Lynn. Continued success with the program. To our members, I'll remind you quickly, you're just going to get a very quick email survey. We'll review those responses so we can keep getting better in our virtual world. Thank you to my team, all of you. Thanks once again to Nolan, Steve, and Lynn. Keep the faith. We're going to get back together at some point in person. I hope soon, but we'll see. But have a great week, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.